Hello, my name is Dr. Jenna Maynard Baker. I hold a master's degree in social work from the University of Pennsylvania and a doctorate in public administration from Westchester University. Previously, I was the executive director of NASW Pennsylvania for 6 years, and I currently teach for Kutztown University. I want to talk to you today about prioritizing equitable suicide prevention, 988 and beyond. The building you see in this picture, I challenge you to identify it. Most of us probably wouldn't be able to. It is Kings Park Psychiatric Hospital, one of the nation's largest psychiatric hospitals. The compound where this building was included many other buildings. It was so large that the staff actually lived on the grounds, and it had its own train station on Long Island. So it is where we put people with mental illness, hospitals like this all across the country. We separated individuals who were experiencing a mental illness from their families, and we believed that people with suicidal ideation were in fact criminals. We created systems where we decided what we were going to do to them, not with them. And in doing so, we created a legacy of distrust among many people who were forced to experience pretty horrific treatments in the name of helping them feel better. So as we talk about the social work code of ethics, I want to remind us all of our fundamental responsibility to social justice. We are ethically mandated to build systems that are informed by the people they serve, that are just and fair, that recognize the inherent dignity and worth of every single human being. Our code of ethics also mandates that we respect the right to self-determination. Far too often, in the name of helping, social service systems deny people their right to self-determination and define for them what we think the right treatment or solution or intervention is. Fundamentally, I am grounded in the belief that nothing about us without us, that the individuals who are most impacted by a system should have a very, very significant voice in shaping those systems. That opinion, perspective, fundamental belief has come from 30 years of social work practice, from juvenile probation to investigating child welfare to holding 4 politically appointed positions and running 3 advocacy agencies. So as we think about suicide prevention and the distrust people have of asking for help and the challenges that presents to the nation's rollout of 988, the Suicide and Crisis Prevention Hotline, we can't forget that in 1927, the Nobel Peace Prize for Psychiatry went to an individual who was inducing fevers in people with schizophrenia by injecting them with malaria-infected blood. So blood infected with malaria was being utilized to give people fevers with the thought that those fevers could cure their schizophrenia. I can guarantee you it did not cure a single human being's schizophrenia, yet it was the treatment that was continually used. In 1941, we were using insulin comas, not only for schizophrenia, but other types of mental illness. We were committed to testing treatments on people that were not producing any benefit for them. But their mental illness was alarming to us, so we warehoused them and turned them into guinea pigs. Now, the first antipsychotic drug was introduced in 1955. Shortly after that Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Services Act in an attempt to open clinics and end the institutionalization of people with mental illness. Starting in 1960, institutions were gradually closed and care was transferred for many people back into the community. Although there was a great deal of community fear about people with mental illness being released back into the community and about a belief that they were dangerous, violent, and not safe. When in fact, there are symptoms of people with mental illness who are unpredictable. A person with a serious mental illness is 11 times more likely to be the victim of a crime than ever perpetrate one. And the majority of times when people with mental illness do engage in violent acts, they're either lost in psychotic delusions and paranoia, or they're having a response to being forced into a situation that feels unsafe to them. So this record player here is George Hellstrom's. George Hellstrom lived with schizophrenia. He was institutionalized at Kings Park Psychiatric Institute his entire adult life, starting sometime after 1938. He died at the institution, Psychiatric Institute, in 1979 from cancer, and he's buried on those hospital grounds. I was 9 years old when George Hellstrom died, and I never knew he existed. George Hellstrom was my great uncle, my beloved grandmother's only sibling. He was institutionalized after his mother died in 1936. She passed away unexpectedly, and my grandmother and my great-grandfather didn't know how to manage his symptoms, and there he spent the rest of his life. Now, how did we treat depression? We started using electric shock therapy because it was seen as better than previous treatments. And they thought there was an improved mood. And the side effects were not nearly as bad as coma therapy, malaria therapy, or lobotomies, none of which are clearly positive options with any evidence of helping anybody. And they carry less risk of fracture than the previous shock therapy. And that shock therapy actually broke the previous shock therapy, actually broke people's vertebrae. The shocks were so bad. And the fracture rate became negligible, helping people and breaking their vertebrae. Okay? But it wasn't without side effects. It included amnesia, and increased suicidal tendencies. So people who struggling with depression were given a treatment, electric conversion therapy, such as Ernest Hemingway, to treat their depression, even though it increased suicidality. And in fact, he died shortly after this treatment. Now, for people who were acutely suicidal, this is a quote from 1914, where the person who at the hospital, or a woman who had attempted suicide, was brought. It says her urging law enforcement to take her to jail because they should charge her with attempted murder. Because she was in so much pain, she cut her own throat and lay down on her bed to just end the pain and go to sleep. And yet, when she was rushed to a nearby hospital, the hospital thought she should be arrested for attempted murder. As a society, we need to respect that everybody has the right to self-determination. I am not saying we shouldn't help folks who are struggling. I'm saying that criminalizing suicidality created an incredibly negative incentive to ever seek help. If you are hurting so badly, you want to die, and the response is to take away your right to self-determination, to arrest you or confine you in a psychiatric hospital, why would you ever ask for help? And I realize that these are not the consequences today, but these days I'm showing you are still not, that long ago when you think about people and generations and histories, and how the messages within a culture stay for long periods of time. And if you challenge that thought, I want to just have us all think for a moment about institutional racism and how blatant it still is within our systems, and homophobia and how blatant that still is in our culture. So when we think about the negative attitudes, the destructive, controlling, minimizing, criminalizing attitudes towards mental illness, we need to understand that 1914 1927, 1949, they really were not all that long ago when it comes to how people today think about mental health and frame help-seeking behavior. Forget the fact that there are a ton of commercials and people saying it's important to seek help. The moment you seek help, what are your options? How culturally responsive to you are they? How empowering to you are they? And how much self-determination do you retain when you say you want to die? Because if we don't change how we respond, we will continue to lose people because they'd rather take their own life than lose their own dignity. So this is Charles Barnes. He traveled to South America as a steel estimator for U.S. Steel. His grandfather was the New York Fire Department fire captain. He was also a leader of the Democratic Party in Brooklyn. He owned a fireman's bar and was quite well known in the community. Charles's father died young. His brother, who was a veteran, died from a gas explosion in his house. He was only 21. And Charles's father and brother, his father was only in his 40s. His brother was 20. His older brother was 21, died within 18 months of each other. He was then left to try to uphold the family name in the prestige of his grandfather. And now with his father and his older brother gone, he wrote essays about not feeling good enough, despite the fact that there are letters from the U.S. Department of Commerce announcing his arrival in Venezuela or Cuba as he traveled to estimate the cost of how much steel was needed for very high profile jobs like bridges. But he still felt like he wasn't good enough. He died by suicide on October 6, 1936, without ever asking for help, without verbalizing how much he was struggling to anybody, just writing in secret. His daughter was only 9 months old. His daughter was my mother. She grew up without a father because he didn't feel it was safe enough to ask anybody for help, because in that time, you were put in a psychiatric hospital if you said you were struggling, despite the fact that he was a well-educated, very successful man, white man. It still wasn't safe to ask for help. So this building is another psychiatric hospital. This is Pilgrim State Institution, Psychiatric Institution, New York State. And I will say that Pilgrim State is where his wife, Margaret, ended up having numerous stays after numerous suicide attempts because she was brokenhearted that her husband was gone. And she just was in so much pain. Her story is different, though. She was able to keep her job as a New York City school teacher, and she was able to keep her children who she was raising with her dead husband's mom. So together, she was able to make it through, but she was hospitalized and exposed to ECT multiple times to treat her depression. Now, half-finished work generally proves to be labor lost, as Abe Lincoln would say. So that Community Mental Health Services Act, Mental Health Act that was signed in 1963, that provided different levels of mental health care in federally funded community centers rather than institutions, was a great first step by John F. Kennedy, made because he'd been inside those psychiatric hospitals and seen how his sister, who did have a forced lobotomy, lived, and thought, this is inhumane. We cannot do this to people. We've never had a president since who had a sibling who was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital. So the passion for that, never realized the level of funding that was needed to bring people into community, provide them with safe and stable housing when their families refused to house them, and to give every human being the dignity that they deserve to make choices about how to live their lives. And we know attitudes are slow to change, so we still have people today in 2024 saying that this was a failed attempt and we should put folks back into psychiatric hospitals against their will. So as we talk about equitable suicide prevention, we always need to be grounded in how do we get to a place where it's not safe to ask for help? And this is how we got to that place. So changing systems requires changing attitudes. In our nation, suicidality is equal to police response. Acute symptoms of mental illness have equal to police response. Now, I don't know about you, but if I go to the bank and some bank robbers come in and they decide to hold me hostage, I want the SWAT team coming to get me. I worked in child welfare. I investigated cases specifically of child sexual abuse. And when I had to go remove kids from families where there was horrific abuse happening, I often brought law enforcement with me because they had plenty of threats that I thought were a little too serious for me to go someplaces alone. So there are absolutely times that law enforcement is needed and the appropriate response. But because our nation sees people with mental illness as violent instead of struggling with a mental illness, the response that's been funded. This is not on law enforcement. The response that our society has chosen to fund is solely and specifically a police response. Public stigma, negative or discriminatory attitudes that others may have about mental illness. You hear it all the time. I don't know about you, but I've gone through McDonald's drive-thru plenty of times and been told the weather is so bipolar. Nobody's ever told me the weather is diabetic. But we use terms related to mental health all of the time in a demeaning, dismissive, stigmatizing way. If I see another billboard for a haunted asylum during Halloween, I literally might run my car into it. Because what message are we sending to people who do need hospital stays? And I am never going to disagree that there are definitely values for high quality, short-term hospitalization stays. It's never where anyone should live their whole life, but the full continuum of care for people does need to exist. But when our society continually has public stigma that turns into self-stigma and internalized shame people have about the conditions they live with, feeling less than, broken, afraid to share their struggle. And then the structural stigma. It's our systems, the policies within government and private organizations that intentionally or unintentionally limit opportunities for people with mental illness. There was a county in Pennsylvania that did an outcome study of people who were arrested for, low-level misdemeanor level crimes who had a mental illness, or people who were 302 involuntarily committed. The life outcomes were better for the people who were arrested than the people who were forced into the mental health system. So we need to stop and think about, are we producing the right outcomes? Are we providing the right choices? Any treatment is not good treatment, and any treatment is not good enough. We would never accept that for heart attack, for heart surgery, or cancer treatment. You see billboards competing between hospitals about who's going to be the best heart center. Where's the best cancer treatment? We don't see billboards competing about the best mental health care provided, best able to help someone understand their schizophrenia or their bipolar. Those things happen in quiet. And those of us who work in the mental health field know where's a good place to go and a less good place to go and a really bad place to go. But there's no public value for that the same way there is for good cancer treatment. Because cancer victims are somehow victims, cancer patients are somehow victims, and people with mental illness have a stigma that somehow they're responsible or flawed, a stigma that is rooted in historical bias that is incredibly damaging, that leads to our increasing suicide rate. So, I'm very delighted that SAMHSA, our federal authority, has decided to focus on actually building a behavioral health emergency response, right? For years, 911, many of us grew up with 911. We've had an emergency system response, but not a behavioral health emergency system response. And so as the federal government invests significant resources in the development of this system, it is critical that as social workers, we are all aware of it, we are all engaged in it, and we are all supportive of it. And that we as social workers, the profession that was formed to be in the streets, helping people at the most critical points in their life, that we are working in the emergency behavioral crisis system. My parents are both LPCs, nothing against any other mental health profession, but social work was founded on the principles of self-determination, social justice, and being where people are and meeting them in those locations. Therefore, as we talk about behavioral health emergency response system, we need to be engaged, and we need to be engaged at every single level of that system transformation. So responding to crisis in the field, there are communities that have police only. So regardless of the time of day, the only response they have is a law enforcement response. And we'll talk about whether they're trained or not. Up until 2020, the national average for police training for de-escalation was 4 hours. There are many, many things officers need to be trained in, but I can guarantee you there's far more time invested in how to drive your car and how to shoot a gun. Most officers never shoot their gun than there was in de-escalation training, and officers de-escalate people every single day of their job. In other communities, there's police and limited mobile crisis. Mobile crisis is a mental health service licensed by a state's mental health authority, Medicaid billable. We need to talk about private insurance needs to pay for mobile crisis as well. And that's where we really have to get parity. And mobile crisis would come to you. Now the challenge is limited mobile crisis means that some places, some mobile crisis teams still hold that stigma that automatically a person in crisis is violent. So they'll only meet them at a hospital, or they'll only meet them. I've heard of only meeting people at a police station. It's not the purpose of mobile crisis. Mobile crisis is that people will go to you. When I was a rape crisis response worker or child welfare worker investigating child sexual abuse, I went to where my children or the recently assaulted victim was, wherever they were, to meet them and support them. And so when we think about mobile crisis having limited response times, that's a challenge. Then there's police with co-responders. Now this doesn't need to be an either or in terms of mobile crisis. And we'll talk about that next. But, you know, there are some communities where there aren't mobile crisis providers. This is especially challenging to have 24/7, 365 mobile crisis response and our really rural or frontier communities. I happen to have lived on a First Nation, and I can say that it's very hard to have that level of staffing 24/7 with a large geographic area and a small population. So, but co-responders are when you have a mental health professional or a peer support professional, who either, you know, they ride separately to a scene or they might ride together. But usually I call co-responding when two people who work for different entities respond to the same scene, versus embedded, where there's someone who works for the police department who goes out on crisis calls. But it's another option that's happening in the field. And then what's happening in some communities, and really kind of the whole shebang, as one might call, is police who are specially trained, and co-responders who respond to specific calls, usually mental health calls. Mobile crisis teams are deployed by 988, and other mental health crisis call centers. And 911 has the ability to if I call 911 and I'm suicidal, they have the ability to transfer me to 988 or to deploy a mobile crisis team, sometimes referred to as an alternative response, but really it's a mobile crisis team. And sometimes those include EMS. There's all kinds of varieties across the nation. So these are the evolution of what is happening in crisis response. The goal here is that if you are in a suicidal crisis, you're really struggling, that you can call 988, engage in crisis counseling, that in some communities, they've got it so that I could call at 10 o'clock at night, I'm really struggling, and they could offer me an appointment the next day somewhere at 2 o'clock to see a therapist. That's an outstanding outcome. Or let me know that there's a living room project or a peer drop-in center I could go visit so I wasn't alone with my thoughts. So, you know, that's ideally what happens with 988. And also when calls come to 911 and they really don't present a public safety risk, that they're able to be connected to mobile crisis and mobile crisis goes out. We know that far too often a police officer who is not specially trained is responding to people in mental health crises. And we know the reality is that a person with a mental illness is 15 times more likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement than someone who doesn't have a mental illness. Those calls can be unpredictable. And also, we need to remember that we are each different disciplines trained to respond to different situations. I would not want, as a social worker, to be expected to respond to a bank robbery and expect anyone to think that I was going to have the best possible outcome of that call, because that's not what I'm designed to do. It's not what I'm educated to do, and it's not what I've been trained to do. So we need to stop thinking that one profession is the only profession that can respond, when in fact, we need to have a full continuum of services. And we need to ensure that mobile crisis is truly mobile. And there is some 24/7, 365 response in every community across the country that is not solely a police response. This is not just my opinion. The Department of Justice has entered into a consent decree with a California county saying they are violating the ADA because all they have to respond to a person in a mental health crisis is law enforcement. If I were to have an illness in which psychosis was a symptom and I hid behind the peanut butter kiosk in the grocery store crying and shaking, and if that community sends law enforcement to respond to me, the Department of Justice has said that is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have a mental illness which is protected, and I have the right to have a response that is tailored to my disability. So when we think about what we're trying to build, this is what we're trying to build. In every community across every state, we want the person in crisis to be able to call a crisis line. We want 911 to connect people in crisis to 988. We want mobile crisis to respond. And if law enforcement does respond and they realize really fast, oh, Jenna's really struggling here, but there is no public safety risk, we want them to call the mobile crisis team and have the mobile crisis team respond. And if law enforcement does respond because there is someone's not willing to go to treatment, there is, a public safety issue, not necessarily public safety risk, but someone is acutely psychotic, trying to direct traffic, getting in the middle of situations that are unsafe for themselves and others, and law enforcement responds, then we need somewhere for law enforcement to bring them, where there will be no right of refusal. Well, they will accept this individual and they will engage in a comprehensive psychiatric assessment to figure out what is going on for that individual and what options will best serve that individual's needs. So whether you call them an emergency behavioral health walk-in crisis center, some people call them stabilization. They have a lot of different names. Every state seems to call them something different. But it's crisis receiving facility. The idea is they are heavily staffed by peer support. Forget the security. If you have qualified, certified peer specialists who can engage in restraining someone if there's a need, but quality peer support who's engaging with people and talking about how are they doing and what do they want and meeting them at that human level, the need to seclude or restrain is going to be minimal. If you have gone into an emergency room recently, you will have seen, most likely, as I have, an individual in a room with a note on the door that says, do not speak to this person, and some officer sitting outside of their door. On your worst day, do you want to be alone with your thoughts and those messages they are telling you? No, I don't. So when you have significant amount of peer support, psychiatric nurse practitioner, and a clinician there to work with you around what's going on with you from a mental health perspective, and just sit with you and hold that space and give you hope that we're going to figure this out and embrace your right to self-determination, it is far more likely to be impactful in a positive way than sticking someone in an emergency room alone with a note on the door that says don't speak to them. And that is this right here in front of you is SAMHSA's vision of what we will build across the country. It will not be built easily, and it definitely needs your advocacy. And what we see as a result of this, when this is in place, which it is in place in many Arizona communities and other communities across the country, Tennessee's made a huge commitment as well as other states, and it's starting to happen in Pennsylvania. Cumberland, Dauphin, Perry counties are building a state-of-the-art crisis receiving facility. Montgomery County is as well. There's definitely Bucks County as well. There's definitely efforts happening. Indiana Armstrong counties are building one on the grounds of a hospital. But what we see is that the fact that a person arrested for misdemeanor level offense with a mental illness stays 5 times longer in jail. If we stop that revolving door with jail being the option, decreased jail engagement, which is all county money, no Medicaid money, people sitting, boarding in emergency departments for weeks on gurneys because your mental health crisis is not going to come before a heart attack or a stroke or a car accident. But if you're brought to a crisis facility, that's the only thing they do. So you're going to come first, right? And so we know that what we want is a system that addresses people's mental health. And if you go in there and you have a mental health issue, but oops, you also have a life-threatening physical health issue, we'll take you to the hospital and then bring you back. But this is a system. This is a realigning of the spokes of the wheel to ensure that people with mental illness are not second-tier clients in our physical health system, but they are the priority in our mental health, our behavioral health crisis system. I want to stop for a second and say, I use the terms behavioral health and mental health interchangeably. It's brain health, right? Whether it's a substance use disorder, psychosis, PTSD, depression, it's in your brain. And we've divided like via physical health and then mental illness. For me, there's physical health and there's brain health, right? And brain health is substance abuse and mental health diagnoses. I really don't draw a differentiation. I think some degree of stigma is involved in separating the two. For me, there's your brain and it's your brain health, and we shouldn't be treating it like it's second to everything else. And the irony of that is we all know our brain is the strongest organ of our body and makes all the decisions for us and has the greatest impact on our entire being. But we treat it like it's less than the rest of our body. So we have 2 systems, the law enforcement health, right? 911, you call and police respond within minutes and they work to resolve the situation. When a person is having a health crisis, EMS responds quickly. There's a current lawsuit, by the ACLU in the District of Columbia saying that the District of Columbia hired, I want to say it's 300 or 400, it's at least 300 new, EMS staff. And there's a 4-minute response time. That's new staff. So there's a 4-minute response time for EMS. And if there's a paramedic on that ambulance, because they're a higher skill level, so they go to the more acute calls, I believe it's a 7-minute response time. Well, the lawsuit is upset because there are only 55 mobile crisis workers, not new ones, 55 for the entire district. And the response time doesn't have a mandate, but it ranges between 2 to 4 hours. So if I'm in acute health crisis, I'm going to get a response between 4 and 7 minutes, somewhere in there. And if I'm having a mental health crisis, maybe it'll be 3 hours, maybe it'll be 4 hours, maybe it'll be 2. And so once again, recognizing that mental illness is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ACLU is taking action on that. In that case. And we know that police still get called to mental health situations because there isn't the investment of public resources. Once again, this is not about police. This is about what is funded to respond, because police do need to respond sometimes and they do need to have specialized training, but we need a system where other options exist. I have done a significant amount of legislative work in partnership with police chiefs and sheriffs, where they would very directly say to me, Jenna, give us different options. All we have is jail or the ED. If you build it, we will use it. But we don't build it. You need to create that for us. And so when we say, oh, police shouldn't respond, they don't get to say no. They're the only profession, them and fire, EMS, who just say, no, I don't feel like going to that call. Sorry. but that does happen in other fields. And so we need to make it clear. We need to create other options, not blame them for responding. So there's limited federal guidance on how to ensure access to crisis services. State governments legislate and regulate crisis response without any federal requirements or mandates. And so Pennsylvania, currently, the crisis system and the funding attached is based on 1993. So super old, 1993 unpromulgated regulations, which means they were never even finalized. And while crisis services are in the state Medicaid plan, the requirements for them are vague and also not actually met in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, even though they're billing Medicaid for them. So states and counties differ on the availability of suicide prevention crisis lines and warm lines. I worked in a state that had a state-funded 24/7 warm line, which was outstanding because the concept of calling a crisis line might feel intimidating. So I think it's important we try to send the message that 988 is a safe place to call, because lots of states don't have warm lines staffed by peer support. So calling somebody is important when you're struggling and you don't know what else to do. Once again, we talked about how very different mobile crisis availability and response is, and that emergency rooms are the most commonly accessible crisis service and the least equipped to appropriately respond and intervene. And also, where is crisis worker discussed as a possible profession in the social work programs, whether it's at the BSW or the MSW? I have taught at the BSW, MSW, and doctorate level, and crisis is never discussed in that world as an option for people who might be drawn to that work. But we need to figure out workforce pipelines. How do we draw more people to want to work in crisis? And a key part of that, in my opinion, is also peer support, because the connection of someone who's been in a similar place as you at your worst moment, is what you need. It's not time for therapy. It's time for someone to say, hey, I got you. We're going to figure this out. That's what we need in crisis. And then we connect them to the mental health services and the medical services and figure out what that solution is. But you're not alone is the message we need to send. And we need to send that quickly, timely, and compassionately. So controlling versus helping roles in society. Agencies have different governing bodies. Mental health professionals are comfortable talking about mental health. So this is when it comes to how do you work with law enforcement, right? Standard operating procedures of police departments mean that officers usually have very little choice in how they respond. So one of the big challenges here as social workers, as we work to really engage in social justice change away from a society that expects, mandates law enforcement to respond, is how do we make that transition where we work with them? So I work for the National Children's Alliance, which is the entity for children's advocacy centers. If you've never been to a children's advocacy center, I encourage you to do so. It is a multidisciplinary teamed approach for investigating child sexual abuse, where the district attorney, law enforcement, child welfare, forensic interviewers, mental health, and medical providers all come together in a shared space to ensure that the best interest of a potentially sexually abused child is met in a timely, compassionate, and kid-friendly manner. And so when we think about crisis, we need to do the same. We need to build bridges and partnerships in different ways than we have in the past. So, the standard operating procedures of police departments can be really frustrating because they seem so limiting, but police officers don't make those up and don't get to choose what they are. And advocates are often tired of being ignored, so they get frustrated on the mental health side that nobody's listening to them. So people with lived experience are kind of put in a little corner because their frustration overwhelms other folks. And police officers, when they're responding, sometimes they're used to seeing people at their worst moment and experiencing some, bias about recovery because they don't see people once they have gotten to a place of wellness or recovery. And we are not cross-discipline, culturally competent at all in terms of understanding how mental health and how social workers specifically and law enforcement can make really great partners, because we can and we should, and but understand many of the concerns. If we don't work together, then we work in silos, and nobody benefits from working in silos. And I'm going to say, as someone who worked for the Office of Criminal Justice Coordinator in New York City, the Mayor's Office for Public Safety and Justice in D.C., someone who worked very closely and in close partnership and in close friendship with law enforcement. Sometimes law enforcement can be difficult partners as we think about crisis response. You know, there's a historical belief that nobody but cops tell cops what to do, which makes interdependent work pretty challenging. They have to have the ability to engage in violence. You can't have a pacifist who's a police officer because, you know, it's a job obligation to be able to respond with physical force when it is warranted. They are expected by society to be invincible. And what is often not discussed is the super, super high levels of trauma and trauma exposure that police officers experience. If an average citizen or even someone with some trauma is here, law enforcement officers are way up here. When you hear them talk about a day that includes picking up body parts off a highway or a dead baby in an oven, it's just one thing that happened that day. You realize that their demeanor might seem aloof only as a self-protection mechanism. Also, there's dark humor, because and I recall when I was a child welfare worker, we had pretty dark humor too, because when you see the worst of humanity, what humanity does to one another, you have to develop some kind of shell. And I also want to stress that people blame individual officers, and absolutely sometimes that is completely warranted. But when you look at what impacts an officer's treatment of the public, one of, if not the most significant factor, is how their command structure treats them. There was a study in the United Kingdom by police officers who said rape, domestic violence, child abuse were the most traumatic aspects of the job in terms of their own mental well-being. Officers in the United States said how their chief or command staff in general treated them was the most taxing on their mental well-being. They could respond to the public and be there for that, but the constant demeaning, demoralizing, lack of procedural fairness, organizational justice, just sucks the life out of them. So we need to think about, not only does the institution of policing have this challenged history around racial justice, it also has a significantly challenged history about how it takes care of its own officers. (911) born in 1968, and it was the number for any crisis. But the only response was 911 was fire and EMS and police. And mental illness was framed as dangerous by society. So I talked already about minimal de-escalation training, the only options they have. Even the really dedicated ones who want to do everything they can, that's still the only options they have are emergency rooms or jails. And emergency rooms often don't keep people, but jail will. We know that when you need to respond to this call because you have 5 more calls behind you, it's why we need more help for law enforcement, and we need a different system for people in crisis. So across the country, there's a movement around police social workers. Police social worker is a degreed social worker who works with law enforcement agencies to address social issues and improve community safety. Police social workers are an important part of police departments and play a vital role in building stronger community relations and reducing repeat service calls. So in some cases, they may ride along with police, but in most police departments that have police social workers, they will be dispatched to a location. The police officer responds to a scene. It's a homeless person who's struggling with their mental health, and they present no public safety issue. So they call the police social worker, and the police social worker comes and takes over that situation and connects that individual to community resources. Law enforcement is always going to be called for issues that are not presenting, not a person robbing a bank or a car accident, right? And that area of the public is concerned and they don't know who else to call. because police will always go out, right? So a police social worker, once again, could ride out with the officer, could be a co-responder to crisis calls, or could be the person who goes and sits with the homeless person, or goes and sits with an elderly person who's struggling with dementia and their family's not engaged, whatever, but they're going to those situations and using all of their social work skills to connect to community resources. And I will use as an example. I got a call once from a law enforcement lieutenant, very concerned that there'd been 99 calls for a safety check, or a home check, not really a safety check, from a woman who believes someone was in her basement or under her bed or in her closet, clearly having delusions. And every time law enforcement went out and they searched her house and told it was fine, she would still call again and again and again. And the officers were to the point that they wanted to arrest her for false reporting. I was called because the lieutenant wanted to have me talk to the woman about her mental health, right? But it was very hard to get her to talk to me because she wouldn't come to where I was. In the case of a police social worker, when the next time that officer went out on one of those calls, the social worker would have come with him and had a conversation with her, and even left the scene and left the police social worker to work with the individual and have the individual start to call the police social worker and when she thought she saw something, right? So like there's a way to change practice. Mobile crisis employed by a mental health agency, completely independent of law enforcement, absolutely needs to happen and should happen. But that doesn't completely solve the issue. And that's where the concept of police social workers is critical. And also, if we're talking about those really rural areas that are never going to be able to afford 24/7 mobile crisis, if you have a social worker responding, you still have a mental health professional who is going to the scene and responding and managing that call, which is what we all want. So there's a current effort in Pennsylvania with criminal justice and social work professors, current police social workers, and police leadership who very much are supportive of this creation of the certification to create some standards for state-sanctioned certification. The school social work certification process and format is being utilized as a model. The goal is to have legislation introduced in 2025 to advance the creation of certification. And as I said, I'm coordinating this effort, and so Kutztown has been coordinating those meetings to really figure out how do we best serve the needs of various populations and ensure that people have a mental health response, even if there isn't one available. So I want to talk about CIT. In 1988, a black man with mental illness was shot and killed in Shelby County by the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department was distraught. The community was outraged. And so the sheriff's department said, we don't know what to do. We do the best we can, but we respond to what we encounter on the street. And at that time, that is when the crisis intervention team model was created. If you've heard of CIT, you might have heard someone call it crisis intervention training. Crisis intervention team. There is no training without the team, and that is the Department of Justice's opinion. So if you live in a community that say they do crisis intervention team or crisis intervention training, but there is no steering committee, they are not doing CIT. So CIT is a vehicle for system change. Partners work together and share accountability for improving their community, their county's crisis response. CIT programs pull together all the pieces of the crisis response to understand the full community picture. They develop strong partnerships able to support one another. When I was involved in the CIT program, I had a very rural police chief call me and say, my guys are getting really frustrated. And I said, well, why? Well, the county goes out, helps these people with hoarding, clean up their houses. And like 2 months later, it's back. So then we did a training about how hoarding was actually an anxiety disorder. And those officers they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. We have a much different response. Another officer police chief who worked at a state university, called me up and say, hey, we didn't realize that like first episode of psychosis happened like 18 to 22. We don't quite know what to do. So we were able to provide a specialized FEP training. In that case, connecting information to the people who might first experience an individual who's starting to struggle. Campus police. Another critical part of CIT is that it's a strong voice for advocacy, for change, both for driving policy and funding change. When I would testify on behalf of crisis services, I would most often testify with police chiefs and sheriffs because they were so committed to having other resources available rather than the revolving door of emergency rooms or jails. And a CIT program brings together those different voices. Also, there's, always celebrating and honoring all these partners. So we used to have an awards event that would include outstanding mental health professional, outstanding law enforcement professional, outstanding advocate, so how do you really bring together these different perspectives? And I say all the time that, from an advocacy systemic change perspective, when you have police, mental health professionals, lived experience advocates, that's a politically diverse group. And that's what we need to move mountains when it comes to funding legislative change at the state and federal levels. If we could all work towards a vision, we can make that vision happen. So what is actually a CIT program? As we talk about making sure that we are providing the most community-based, responsive, equitable, and culturally competent response to individuals. We want people together figuring out what is working and not working in their county. We don't want fragments, right? And so when parties are going to work together to have a CIT program, you need to have parties sign MOUs about how they're going to communicate, what information they're going to share. And there has to be a steering committee. There are many counties that I've encountered who hold CIT training, which has to be 40 hours altogether, but CIT training, and say they're doing CIT. They're not. And so the core component of a CIT, the most essential part of a CIT program, is the steering committee. And that steering committee has to assess the community's needs. And the steering committee needs to be truly inclusive. Faith communities, leaders from across different sub-communities, different cultures, assessing what that community needs, advocating for the resources to support a full continuum of culturally competent crisis response services. The committee takes minutes and functions with intentionality, and they problem solve specific situations. How do they make sure that what is needed in that community to respond to all people in a mental health crisis is present? There's ongoing open communication about various aspects of the community response to identify those gaps, and they work in partnership and shared accountability for improving their county or community's response to people in crisis. Instead of this response, that response, there's what happens when you call 911 versus you call 988 versus law enforcement versus mobile crisis versus the police social worker co-respond. They're all at one table together. They all have their roles, but they come to that table together, just like they do in a children's advocacy center, to map out what exists and what doesn't exist, and how do we ensure that the right response goes to the right calls? How do we make sure that people get what they need based on what's happening at that moment and the information available, and ensuring their safety and their well-being? This slide just talks a little bit about what is a CIT officer. And I'm just going to say, in the world of law enforcement, if you're a SWAT officer, you have a higher standard. If you're a crisis negotiator, and a crisis negotiator is not the same as a CIT officer, just to be clear. And you have standing if you're an accident reconstructionist or canine. But the reality is that a CIT officer, which is a unique breed, and you're someone who specializes in slowing things down, taking the time to talk, sitting with someone and holding that space with them, a CIT officer doesn't have that same standing or perceived value within departmental structures in most cases. They're seen as, that's the soft one, that's the nice one. The reality is that a CIT officer is a specialized skill that we should be embracing as society with the same level of respect that we give to other specializations. And they are folks that are willing to spend the time listening and connecting to folks who may in fact present a public safety risk, but also have a clear mental illness driving their actions. They need to self-select They need to want to have relationships with mobile crisis so they can function in an interdependent way. They need to train often on the use of non-lethal force and retreat tactics, to de-escalate a person, not to elevate it. They need to be patient and be okay with the fact that maybe the person doesn't do exactly what they said the first time they said it. It's a different type of approach. So there is no CIT training, which is a 40-hour training week, which is required for every certified CIT officer outside of the rest of what I've just talked about. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police created a One Mind campaign and that called for 100% of police officers to be certified in mental health first aid. And if a community wants to take a first step, they should do mental health first aid for all officers. It's an opportunity to have a discussion about mental health in a non-stigmatizing educational format that is outside of a traditional police training. Because mental health individuals, mental health professionals should be doing mental health training for law enforcement. Law enforcement should not be doing mental health training for law enforcement. CIT, that 40-hour training week, is an immersion training week. It must happen in 1 week, or the Department of Justice says it's absolutely not providing any Section 1903 civil rights protection. There are still communities, and even in Pennsylvania, where they do 1 day a week for 5 weeks and say that's CIT. It's not CIT. It's not certified. It's not able to be certified by CIT International, and it is not providing them any ADA violation protection from the Department of Justice. There should be a subcommittee that plans that week, and all of the instructors must be subject matter experts with educational backgrounds. And this is an important role social workers can play. Social workers can be those content experts presenting to officers on issues like first episode psychosis, excited delirium, signs of depression, how to engage with a person with PTSD or severe anxiety. So an outstanding place for social workers to be is in presenting that information to law enforcement. There's also going to be 10 hours of de-escalation training with each officer passing a role play, and site visits to a location for peers where peers are doing well. That includes conversation. My favorite is a clubhouse. Peer drop-in centers are also outstanding. You know, and a CIT program also has to have advanced training and skill refreshers, just as any police specialty does. CIT is something that lots of departments said, we're just going to have everyone trained, and then we said we did that. That's not what CIT is. CIT is just like we have forensic social workers or school social workers or public police social workers or clinical social workers. CIT should be viewed the same within the law enforcement land as a specialty practice, just like SWAT and accident reconstruction is. But society doesn't value mental health enough to demand this within their communities. So outline clear roles and train together, right? Everything needs to be data informed. We need to look at who are mobile crisis responding to. Are mobile crisis, say, responding to more calls with women in crisis, and law enforcement is responding to a higher percentage of calls with men in crisis? Like, what's happening? What's happening based on race? What's happening based on socioeconomic level in terms of how crisis calls are handled? And if we can't get everyone to the same table, we can't collect that data. And data collection is really important. Data collection within a CIT program is really critical because we need to know who law enforcement is responding to, who's calling 988, and that's meeting their needs, who mobile crisis is responding to. If we're going to have equitable, culturally competent suicide prevention in all of our communities, we need to see where are resources being delivered to who and how, and what are the outcomes of that. It goes back to, we injected people with malaria or put them in insulin comas, even though nobody ever got better from any of those results. We still did it, right? So we need to stop that approach and say, we need to look at the data. We need to look at the results. We need to hold ourselves as practitioners and county and state government provides funding, federal government as well, accountable for funding the approaches that will actually help people find the path to their wellness, to understanding whatever their unique challenges in life related to their brain health, or that situational experience of having, a lot of things can happen at one time, and any one of us can find ourselves not wanting to be here any longer because we're overwhelmed, right? So we need to collect that data. We collect that data on strokes, on heart attacks, on cancer. And then people brag about their success rates. We don't collect that kind of data on mental health, on suicidality, on substance use. And we seem to not collect it because we don't believe fundamentally that people can live happy, productive lives with a brain difference, right? So we need these partnerships to come together. We need to have clarity of roles, and we need data to figure out how we change practice, how we advance the belief in the right to self-determination, and the right to self-determination, and in the right to having the resources we need at the moments we need it to live happy, successful, and productive lives. So the requirements of a CIT program, as I said, a steering committee, that ongoing system evaluation from all perspectives with everybody at that table, super inclusive, super diverse, population diverse, identity diverse, professional diverse, really coming together. And that means we can't blame each other and we can't fight with each other. We need to say we have a shared problem. We need a shared solution. CIT training committee to figure out what is really needed, as ongoing refreshers, and how do you make sure you have the most impactful presenters possible in your CIT program. And then creating a program identity. Be proud of the fact that you are elevating crisis work. Be proud of the fact that you are taking the time to understand what your community needs. I happen to be the parent of a 21-year-old gifted individual with autism, who's also transgender. My 21-year-old transgendered, I don't like the word autistic, but my 21-year-old child was transgender, on the autism spectrum, and intellectually gifted. I have always been in fear of contacting the formal system. And when they have struggled with suicidality, I've watched a lot of Guy Fieri cooking shows, snuggled up in bed, being present for my child rather than trusting the formal system. My goal in this information is that every community can build a system where moms like me aren't afraid to call for help, and grandpas like mine don't die unnecessarily, and folks like my great uncle are connected to community and family rather than warehoused away and their lives lost to their communities. So when we think about the crisis system, 988, there's so much beyond that, but we also need to make sure that we are letting folks know that we are building this system. And the challenge I have for each one of you is to find out what's happening in your township, what's happening in your county, and how do we advance systemic change at the state level that really invests in community mental health services. Not one-time investments. Governor made a one-time $100 million investment to school. Well, that's great if it was paying for ongoing services, but a one-time investment is more likely to result in, door locks, metal detectors, and, intervention kits in case someone gets shot, than they are to invest in things that really change the resources available in a community. We want to make sure that we are changing resources to meet somebody where they're at in that moment, where they're struggling with staying here, where they're struggling with wanting to live. And we need to not do that in a way that is paternalistic or patronizing. We need to do that in a way that's culturally competent, that respects individual identity, and that uses the available community resources and builds new ones when we don't have those that we need. And I live in great fear that we are going to continue to have fragmented crisis response, even though this is our chance, this is our time in history to get everybody together, the way that the Children's Advocacy Center movement led by Congressman Bud Kramer, created the National Children's Alliance and really brought everyone together to transform and prevent the further victimization of child sexual abuse victims. We have done it before as a nation. We can do it again with crisis systems. Challenge is nobody stigmatizes child sexual abuse victims, and society at large stigmatizes people struggling with mental health challenges, behavioral health challenges, brain health issues. So we must ask ourselves, what role do we play in ending that stigma? What role do we play in making sure our community has equitable, culturally competent, well-trained, and compassionate responses that allow people choice and ensure the right to self-determination? I appreciate your time. I appreciate your awareness to this issue. I want to say that there's a lot of resources online. If you Google SAMHSA's roadmap to the ideal crisis system, you will find a ton of resources. We've also included my email address and the CIT International website. There's a downloadable best practice guide on the CIT website that helps you figure out how to start a CIT program. I never intended to become an advocate for CIT, but when I understood its true purpose of bringing all partners to the table together, including the voice of individuals with lived experience, especially, peers and families, because they will tell you what is and is not working in a way that is direct and honest. And I realized that it was a model that brought all of those perspectives to a shared table, figure out how to work together and how to make systemic change locally and at a statewide level. I realized how critical it was that we advance this model as social workers committed to social justice. The CIT International Conference happens every August. The next conference is in California, and many states are starting to have local CIT programs, state chapters. And as we think about crisis response, there's so much opportunity from working at a 988 call center to being a mobile crisis responder, to being an instructor at a CIT program, to being a CIT coordinator. There's so much we can do to change how we respond to people in crisis, how we respect their dignity, their worth, and how, as a social justice mandate, we fix a system that's been broken for far, far too long. And we end the stigma and the pain and the isolation that so many people struggling with brain health experience. So thank you for your time. And once again, please reach out with any questions.